The research outpost hummed with quiet energy, the soft glow of data screens illuminating the sterile metallic walls. Daniel moved between workstations, muttering to himself as he analyzed the latest energy readings. His mind was deep in calculations, completely unaware that death was watching him from the shadows. Kiris crouched on the beams above, her body wrapped in the dark bodysuit of her people, its surface shifting to blend into the ceiling. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing controlled. She had been trained for moments like this, to slip through the cracks of a target's life unseen, unheard, until the final strike. Humans were careless, arrogant in their belief that they could match the Zenari. Daniel Everett was no different. He was brilliant, that much was clear, but his mind was focused on numbers and theories, not the silent predator stalking him. She raised her wrist, the blade within her gauntlet sliding out with a whisper of metal. One quick movement, and the mission would be complete. Another pawn removed from the board, another threat to the Dominion eliminated. Then the explosion hit. A deafening blast tore through the outpost, sending metal and fire in all directions. Kiris barely had time to react before the force of the blast sent her body flying. She crashed against a bulkhead, pain flaring through her side. The world spun. Alarms screamed. Smoke filled the air. She tried to move, but her limbs were sluggish, unresponsive. A deep, searing heat burned through her thigh, where a jagged piece of metal had pierced through the suit and into her flesh. She was trapped. Heavy footsteps approached. She tensed, bracing herself to fight, but her body refused to listen. Through the haze, she saw Daniel kneeling beside her. His hands were on her wound before she could react, pressing down to slow the bleeding. His face was so close, warmer, softer than she had expected. His dark eyes flicked over her body, scanning her injuries, but there was no suspicion in them, only urgency. "You're hurt," he said, his voice thick with concern. "Don't move." Kiris blinked, disoriented. She had been trained to resist pain, to fight through it, but the warmth of his hands on her skin sent a strange, foreign sensation rippling through her. No one had ever touched her like this. Not with care. She tried to push him away, but her strength failed. He took it as a sign of weakness, not resistance. "I've got you," he murmured. He lifted her effortlessly, her body pressing against the heat of his chest. His scent filled her senses. Earthy, something faintly metallic, and something else. Human. His grip was firm but gentle, like he was afraid of hurting her. Kiris wanted to kill him. She needed to kill him. But as he carried her through the wreckage, shielding her from falling debris, she felt the edges of her world unraveling. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the small infirmary. Kiris lay still on the bed, her body wrapped in fresh bandages. The painkillers dulled the sting of her injuries, but they couldn't silence the storm raging inside her. Daniel sat beside her, his elbow resting on the edge of the bed as he studied her with quiet curiosity. "You're lucky," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Another few inches, and that shrapnel would have gone through an artery." Kiris turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. He had no idea who she was, no idea that she was supposed to be his executioner. She should end it now, but her body refused to move. She had been trained to analyze weaknesses, to exploit them. Daniel's weakness was painfully obvious. He cared. Even now, when logic should have dictated that she was a stranger, an unknown, he had risked himself to save her. His fingers brushed against the bandages on her arm, adjusting them gently. Her skin tingled beneath his touch. Her people didn't believe in physical closeness, not beyond what was necessary for procreation. Love was an illusion, a weakness that made beings reckless. She had been taught that her entire life. So why did this man's touch unravel something inside her? "You don't talk much, do you?" he said with a small smile. Kiris stared at him, uncertain how to respond. He took her silence as shyness and leaned back slightly. "Are you from one of the outpost teams?" "I don't recognize you," he mused, studying her face. She swallowed, quickly forming a lie. "I was transferred in recently." He nodded. "Makes sense. You've got the look of someone used to being alone." Her breath hitched. She looked away, ignoring the warmth in her chest. The days blurred together. Kiris healed quickly, faster than a human would have. Daniel assumed it was adrenaline, a natural resilience, but Kiris knew better. She spent hours watching him. He was nothing like the cold, brutal creatures her people had described. He was passionate, reckless, determined. When he worked, he lost himself in his research, muttering calculations under his breath, pacing the room in frustration when something didn't align. She caught herself watching him too much. One evening, he brought her food. The gesture was small, insignificant, yet something about it sent an unfamiliar tightness through her throat. He sat beside her, handing her a cup of something warm. "You should eat," he said. She hesitated before taking a sip. The liquid was rich, smooth. She had never tasted anything like it. He chuckled at the look on her face. "Good, right? That's cocoa. It's kind of a staple comfort drink for humans." She nodded slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest. She didn't understand this. She didn't understand him. "You don't let people get close to you, do you?" he asked suddenly. Kira stiffened. He watched her, his eyes searching. "I know that look. I had it too once, after my wife was killed." Her grip tightened around the cup. "I told myself I didn't need anyone," he continued, "that letting people in only led to pain. But eventually I realized something." She swallowed. "What?" His gaze softened. "Being alone isn't the same as being strong." Her breath caught. She wasn't sure what made her do it. Maybe it was the warmth of his voice, or the way his fingers lightly brushed against hers when he reached for his own drink. Maybe it was the exhaustion of fighting a war within herself. But when he leaned in, she didn't pull away. His lips barely brushed against hers, testing, hesitant. She should have stopped him, should have ended this. Instead, she pressed closer. His hands slid to her waist, his touch careful but firm, as if she would shatter if he held her too tightly. Heat coiled in her stomach as his fingers traced along the curve of her back. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared for him. When he pulled back, his breath was warm against her lips. "I don't know what you're running from," he whispered, "but you don't have to run from me." She should have killed him. Instead, she let him hold her. The lights in the research outpost were dim, casting long shadows over the sleek metallic surfaces. Kira sat near the edge of the main console, watching Daniel as he worked, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface. His brows furrowed in concentration, the faint glow of the data screen reflecting in his dark eyes. She had spent days studying him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Yet as the days stretched on, the moment never came. "You don't talk much," Daniel said without looking up. His voice was calm, almost teasing. Kira's shifted slightly. "I speak when necessary." A small smile pulled at the corner of his lips. "Efficient. Makes sense." She watched him, the way his hands moved with purpose, the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed with each adjustment. He was dedicated, driven. Everything he did was for his people. He believed in what he was doing. It was unsettling. Daniel stepped back from the console, sighing, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've been running simulations all day. I need a break." He turned to her, his eyes scanning her carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Your injuries." "I am fine." His gaze lingered for a moment before he nodded. "You heal fast." Kira tilted her head, watching him with quiet curiosity. Humans ask too many questions. Only when we're curious. He grinned, folding his arms across his chest. "You're different from the others here. It's like you don't belong." Her heart lurched at his words. She didn't. Not really. But she couldn't let him know that. He turned away, walking toward a counter on the far side of the lab. He pulled a small, steaming mug from a dispenser and returned to her side. "Here," he said, handing it to her. She hesitated before taking it. The warmth spread through her fingers, sending an unfamiliar sensation up her arms. She lifted the cup, inhaling the rich, unfamiliar scent. "What is this?" "Cocoa," he said. "Something comforting." She took a cautious sip, her tongue tingling at the sweetness. It was pleasant, unexpectedly so. Daniel watched her, his expression unreadable. Do the Zenari have anything like that? Something warm, something meant to make you feel good? Kira shook her head slowly. "We do not eat for pleasure. Food is fuel." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That's depressing." She frowned. Efficiency is the foundation of strength. Maybe. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, studying her with quiet intensity. But I think strength also comes from connection, from understanding each other. Kira swallowed. Something in the way he looked at her made her feel unsteady. She was trained to resist emotion, but this was different. You never answered my question, he continued softly. Kira blinked. What question? Why you always seem like you're standing on the edge of something, like you're not sure whether to step forward or run. Her grip tightened around the cup. She had spent years bearing anything that resembled hesitation. But here in this quiet space, with this human watching her with something close to patience, the walls inside her cracked, just a little. He was still watching her, waiting. She looked down at the cocoa, turning the cup slowly between her hands. I was not given a choice in the path I walk. Daniel's expression softened. Maybe it's time you take one. Her breath hitched. He said it so easily, like it was simple, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Could it? The warmth of the cocoa seeped into her skin, into her chest, wrapping around something inside her she didn't understand. Later that night, Kira stood by the large observation window, looking out into the endless dark of space. Stars stretched in every direction, their cold brilliance casting faint light over the room. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence before he spoke. You don't sleep, do you? Daniel's voice was quiet, his tone laced with something gentle. She shook her head. Not often. He stepped beside her, the space between them just enough to feel the warmth of his body without touching. You've been watching me, he said after a moment. Her muscles tensed. You watch me too, he chuckled. I suppose I do. Silence stretched between them, heavy with something neither of them had words for. You lost someone, Kira said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Daniel's expression shifted, pain flickering through his eyes before he turned his gaze back to the stars. Yeah, my wife. Kira studied his profile. There was something different in the way he carried himself when he spoke of her. Something fragile, something deeply human. She was killed in a Zenari raid, he continued. Years ago, I was supposed to be there, but I wasn't. And that's the kind of thing you don't ever really let go of. Kira swallowed, her throat tight. I am sorry. He glanced at her, surprised. Are you? She wasn't sure how to answer. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't think I ever stopped grieving. I just learned how to carry it. Kira looked away. Grief was foreign to her, an emotion reserved for the weak. And yet, standing beside him, feeling the weight of his words settle between them, she wasn't so sure anymore. She turned to him, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. If you could change it, if you could bring her back, would you? He hesitated, then met her gaze. No. She stiffened. Why? His voice was barely above a whisper. Because if I hadn't lost her, I wouldn't have met you. Something inside Kira shattered. She didn't move when he reached for her, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. She didn't flinch when he stepped closer, his breath warm against her skin. Her mind screamed at her to step back, to run. But she didn't. His hand slid up her arm, slow, deliberate, until his palm rested against the side of her neck. His touch was impossibly gentle, like he was waiting for her to push him away. She didn't. Her breath came in shallow, uneven pulls. He leaned in, his lips grazing hers so softly it sent a shock through her body. It wasn't a demand, not a claim. It was a question. And for the first time in her life, Kira answered without thinking. She kissed him. His other hand found her waist, fingers pressing into the fabric of her suit, pulling her closer. Heat coiled deep in her stomach, something raw and unfamiliar igniting beneath her skin. She pressed into him, her body molding against his warmth seeping into every inch of her. His lips moved against hers, slow and careful, as if savoring the moment, as if this wasn't something fleeting. His fingers traced up her spine, sending a shiver through her. Her own hands found his chest, the steady thrum of his heartbeat against her palm, grounding her in a way she never expected. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his breath heavy. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She couldn't. Instead, she closed the distance between them again, her lips capturing his with something close to desperation. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run. The cold night air pressed against her skin as Kiris moved silently through the facility. The darkness was familiar, comforting. Her instincts were sharp, senses heightened. She had done this 1,000 times before, scouting, assessing, eliminating. But this time, her purpose felt unsteady. She had spent too many nights watching Daniel instead of killing him. She knew his habits, the way he sipped his coffee absent-mindedly while working, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was deep in thought. She knew the warmth of his hands, the softness in his voice when he asked about her. She had delayed too long. A shift in the shadows caught her attention. Before she could react, a blade sliced through the air, narrowly missing her throat. She twisted, dodging just in time, feeling the rush of wind against her skin. Another Zenari assassin, cloaked in the same black bodysuit as her own, stood before her. His eyes gleamed under the moonlight. "You were given a task," he whispered coldly. "You failed." Kiris barely had time to block the next strike. The clash of metal rang in her ears as their blades met. She moved fast, but he was faster. He was sent to kill her, just as she had been sent to kill Daniel. The Dominion had no patience for hesitation. The fight was brutal, silent. Blades flashed in the dark, the only sound their labored breaths and the scrape of steel. Kiris landed a blow, cutting deep into his side, but he didn't falter. Pain was meaningless to them. They had been trained to endure. She wasn't going to survive this, unless she broke the rules. She feigned a stumble, drawing him in close, then struck fast, burying her blade deep in his chest. His body stiffened, eyes wide with shock. He gasped, trying to speak, but the words never came. She held him as he collapsed, blood soaking into her gloves. For the first time in her life, the kill didn't feel like a victory. A rustle behind her made her spin, weapon raised. But it wasn't another assassin, it was Daniel. His eyes widened at the sight before him, her body covered in blood, the corpse at her feet. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "What the hell is going on?" His voice was rough, uncertain. Kiris swallowed hard, chest rising and falling too fast. She had been exposed. Daniel stepped closer, cautiously searching her face for answers. "Tell me the truth." She wanted to run, wanted to lie. Instead, she took a slow breath and said, "I was sent to kill you." His jaw clenched. He looked away for a moment, running a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Of course," he muttered under his breath. "Of course you were." She waited for him to react, for the anger, the fear, the betrayal. But when he looked at her again, all she saw in his eyes was pity. "You don't want to," he said softly, as if realizing it for the first time. "That's why you haven't done it." Her fingers trembled. "I don't know what I want." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "That's the problem, isn't it? They never let you decide." She didn't respond. She couldn't, because it was true. Daniel took another step forward, closing the space between them. His voice dropped to something almost intimate, as if afraid to break whatever fragile thing existed between them. "If you were never given a choice, then why not make one now?" The weight of his words pressed against her chest. He was giving her something she had never been given before. A chance. Her breath shuddered. She should kill him. Instead, she let the blade slip from her grasp. The night stretched on, but neither of them moved from where they stood inside Daniel's quarters. She had followed him back, silent, unsure of what to say, unsure if he would even let her stay. He sat at the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, looking at her like she was something fragile, something human. "Are you going to kill me?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. She shook her head. "Then what happens now?" Kiris hesitated before speaking. "I don't know." Daniel let out a breathy laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "That makes two of us." She watched him carefully. He wasn't afraid of her. Even knowing what she was, what she had been sent to do, he wasn't afraid. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "Like what?" "Like I'm some kind of puzzle you're trying to solve." Kiris tilted her head. Perhaps you are. Daniel shook his head, smiling softly. That's not fair. You're just as much a mystery to me. Silence lingered between them again, heavier this time. He studied her, searching for something she didn't know how to give. Then he reached for her. His fingers brushed against her wrist, barely touching, just enough to feel the warmth of her skin. She tensed, but she didn't pull away. You can leave, he murmured. If that's what you want, I won't stop you. Kiris stared at him, at the gentle way he spoke, at the way his touch burned without pain. She didn't move. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers sliding higher, tracing the inside of her palm, up her arm, stopping just at the curve of her shoulder. His touch was careful, deliberate, as if he was memorizing the shape of her. Her breath hitched. This was dangerous. She had been trained to ignore desire, to treat touch as nothing more than necessity. But this was different. He pulled her closer, enough that she could feel the heat of his body against hers. His hand slid to her waist, fingertips pressing lightly against the fabric of her suit. He was giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When he kissed her, it was slow, careful, a question she had no words for. She answered without hesitation. Her hands found his shoulders, pressing into the warmth of his skin as he deepened the kiss. He moved slowly, like he wanted her to feel everything, every breath, every touch. Her fingers slipped beneath the fabric of his shirt, feeling the muscles tense beneath her palms. His breath hitched against her lips. You don't have to, he started, but she silenced him with another kiss. She wanted this. She wanted him. Daniel's hands explored the curve of her spine, pulling her closer, guiding her until she was pressed against him, until she was no longer thinking, only feeling. Her body burned in a way she had never known before. She had always been in control, always followed orders. But tonight, for the first time in her life, Kiris made a choice, and she chose him. The base was silent, but the air between them was thick with tension. Kiris stood near the console, arms crossed, watching Daniel and his team move with urgency. He was organizing the last defensive systems, his hands working quickly over the controls. His brows were furrowed in concentration, but his shoulders carried a different weight, worry. They're coming, aren't they? Daniel finally said, not looking up. Kiris stepped forward, her voice quieter than usual. Yes. She could see the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers stilled for just a moment before continuing. He had known this was inevitable. He had seen it in her the moment she told him the truth. Daniel turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. And what happens when they get here? They will demand my return, and they will demand your death. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded. Then we don't give them the chance. She admired that about him. No hesitation, no fear. At least not the kind that paralyzed. He felt things deeply, and that made him dangerous in ways the Zenari had never understood. Kiris stepped closer. You need to be prepared. He let out a sharp breath, rubbing his temples. We're outnumbered, outgunned. She reached out before she realized what she was doing, her fingers brushing against his wrist. His pulse was steady but strong beneath her touch. He looked at her, eyes dark and unreadable. You don't have to stay, he murmured. Kiris felt something deep in her chest tighten. She had always been alone, always followed orders. But now someone was offering her a way out. And yet, I do have to stay. Her voice was steady, but the weight of those words made something shiver inside her. His expression softened, and then slowly, his fingers closed around hers. Then we fight together. She knew she should step back, that she should break the moment before it became something she couldn't control. But she didn't move. She let his warmth seep into her, let herself hold on to something real for just a little longer. Then the alarms blared. The Zenari had arrived. The sky above them burned red with the glow of incoming Dominion warships. Kiris's pulse quickened as the ships descended, sleek and menacing against the dark expanse of space. Daniel grabbed her hand. Is there any way to talk them down? Kiris shook her head. This is not a negotiation. The warships opened their hatches and armored Zenari warriors descended onto the base. At the front, Varak Tavan, her former mentor, stood tall, his silver eyes piercing through the battlefield. His voice carried through the wind, cold and commanding. "Kiris Varkal," he called out. "Come forward." Kiris took a step ahead of Daniel, her shoulders stiff. "I am here." Varrock studied her for a moment, then nodded as if he had expected this. "You were given an order." Kiris clenched her fists. "I refuse." A flicker of something crossed Varrock's face. Disappointment, amusement. It was hard to tell. "You disappoint me," he said, tilting his head. "But the Dominion has always known how to deal with failure." With a flick of his wrist, the Zenari forces attacked. The air was filled with gunfire, the sharp clash of metal against metal. Kiris fought beside Daniel, moving with lethal precision. But this time her strikes were not cold and calculated. This time she fought with anger, with purpose, with something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She was not just a weapon anymore. Daniel's breath was harsh beside her as he fired at the advancing Zenari. He wasn't trained like her, but he didn't stop, even as sweat dripped from his temple. Then she heard it, a shout of warning. She turned just in time to see a Zenari soldier tackle Daniel to the ground. Her heart stopped. Daniel struggled, but the soldier's blade was already at his throat. He was going to die. She was going to lose him. And she couldn't let that happen. A roar tore through her as she lunged, faster than she had ever moved before. She took down the soldier with a single brutal strike, her pulse hammering in her ears. She grabbed Daniel's hand, pulling him up. His eyes were wild, his breath uneven. "We're not going to win this, are we?" Kiris knew the answer. More ships were descending. More Zenari warriors were surrounding them. And then, Daniel cried out, a Zenari stun bolt struck him in the chest, his body jerking. Before he collapsed to the ground, Kiris screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his chest. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale. She looked up, fury burning through her veins. Varrock stood over them, expression unreadable. "You had a choice, Kiris," he said. "You chose poorly." Then, without another word, he signaled to his soldiers. They took Daniel. She fought, clawed, screamed, but they dragged him onto the warship before she could stop them. Then the engines roared to life, and he was gone. The battlefield was silent now, littered with the fallen. The wind carried the scent of burning metal and blood. Kiris stood there, staring at the empty sky where the warship had vanished. Her hands curled into fists. Daniel was gone. They had taken him. She could run. She could leave and disappear into the shadows once more, become the ghost she was trained to be. But she didn't want to. Something inside her had shifted, something she could never bury again. She loved him. She loved him, and she was going to get him back. Her choice had already been made. The warship hummed with cold efficiency, its corridors silent except for the rhythmic pulse of the ship's systems. Kiris moved like a shadow, her body blending into the darkness, her breath steady despite the storm raging inside her. Every step brought her closer to him. Every second was borrowed time. Her pulse quickened as she reached the security checkpoint. A single guard stood at the panel, unaware of her presence. She struck fast, a clean movement, silent, lethal. The body crumpled before he could make a sound. She caught him, lowering him gently to the floor. She shouldn't care, but something about Daniel had changed her. The way he had looked at her, not as a weapon, but as a person. The way he had touched her, his fingers lingering on her skin like she was something precious. The way he had whispered her name, as if it meant everything. She found the control panel and tapped into the system, her fingers moving instinctively. The map of the ship glowed before her. She found his location instantly. The interrogation chambers, deep within the heart of the warship. They were breaking him. A tremor ran through her. She had seen Dominion interrogations. She had been trained in them. Daniel would not last much longer. She moved faster. The corridors blurred as she slipped through the ship, avoiding patrols with practiced ease. Her body ached from the wounds she had taken in the battle, but she ignored it. Pain was nothing compared to the thought of losing him. She reached the chamber. The door was sealed, reinforced with energy barriers. She pressed against the panel, overriding the security locks. The seconds stretched unbearably. Then finally the door hissed open. He was slumped in the chair, restrained by heavy metal cuffs. His face was bloodied, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart clenched. His head lifted at the sound of the door. His eyes met hers, dazed but still full of that impossible fire. "Kiris!" His voice was barely a whisper, but she heard it like a scream. She moved to him, hands already working to free him. "Can you stand?" He gave a weak chuckle. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" The restraints released with a final click. He slumped forward and she caught him, his weight pressing against her. His body was warm, solid, too weak to stand on his own. For a moment, she just held him. He exhaled against her neck, his breath shaky. "I knew you'd come." She swallowed hard. "I'll always come for you." His fingers brushed against her waist, light and hesitant. "They'll come after us." "I know." His grip tightened slightly. "Then we run." She nodded, helping him to his feet. He leaned into her, his body trembling, but his hands were steady as they pressed against her for support. They moved together, slipping through the corridors. The alarm blared now, their escape already detected. Kiris's mind raced. How many guards? How much time? How far to the escape pods? She didn't let go of him. Footsteps echoed behind them. She turned sharply, pressing him against the cold metal wall, shielding him with her body as a patrol passed. His breath was warm against her skin. His hands gripped her waist, fingers pressing into her suit. The closeness of him sent something sharp and electric through her. He was watching her, eyes heavy-lidded, his gaze flicking to her lips before returning to her eyes. She should have pulled away. She didn't. Instead, she leaned in. Her lips barely brushed against his. Just a whisper of a touch, but it was enough. Enough to send fire through her veins, enough to steal her breath. His hands tightened on her waist. "Kiris!" She kissed him fully this time, urgent, desperate, as if she could anchor herself to this moment, to him. His lips were rough, bruised, but he kissed her back just as fiercely. For a moment, the war, the danger, everything else disappeared. Then the sound of approaching guards shattered the moment. She pulled back, her breath unsteady. "We have to move." Daniel nodded, still holding on to her like he was afraid she'd disappear. "Lead the way." They reached the escape bay, the doors already opening to reveal the row of pods. She hurried him toward one, helping him inside. The ship was already shaking, emergency alarms screeching through the halls. She started to step in after him, and then she froze. Her whole life had been dedicated to the Dominion. If she left now, she could never go back. She would be hunted for the rest of her life. She hesitated, just for a moment. Daniel reached for her, fingers closing around her wrist. "Kiris." She met his gaze, saw the quiet plea in his eyes. He wasn't asking her to leave her past behind. He was asking her to choose him. She took a deep breath, and she chose. She let him pull her inside, the door sealing shut behind them. The escape pod launched, the force sending them crashing into each other. She held on to him, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against hers. He let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "I can't believe you just did that," she smirked. "Neither can I." He touched her face, fingers tracing along her jaw. "You didn't have to come back for me." She covered his hand with hers. "Yes, I did." His eyes darkened, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. "I don't deserve you." Her chest ached. "You do!" His hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer. His lips met hers again, slower this time, lingering, savoring. She had never believed in love, but this felt like something worth believing in. Their world was still falling apart around them, but they had each other, and that was enough. The ship drifted through the void, lost among the stars. It had been weeks since they escaped, weeks since Kiris had torn herself from everything she had ever known. Now she was here, in a stolen freighter with the only person in the universe who had ever made her feel human. Daniel sat at the ship's control panel, staring at the readings. His hands rested loosely on the console, his fingers tracing absent-minded patterns on the metal. His thoughts were far away, but Kiris could feel the tension in his body. She moved behind him, placing her hands on his shoulders. He sighed at her touch, his muscles relaxing beneath her fingers. "We can't keep running," he murmured. "I know," she said, her voice soft. His hand covered hers, holding it there. "Then we do this. We take the fight to them." She stepped around him, kneeling beside him so they were eye to eye. The low light of the ship reflected in his gaze, the weight of everything pressing between them. She reached out, tracing the bruise on his cheek with feather-light fingers. "They'll never stop hunting us," she whispered. Daniel's lips quirked into a half-smile. "Then we make them afraid of us." Her breath caught as he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The warmth of him seeped into her, grounding her in a way nothing else could. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer. She let herself need this, if only for a moment. "You changed everything," he murmured. She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "So did you." His lips brushed against hers, a question more than a demand. She answered without hesitation, pressing into him, letting the heat build between them. His fingers curled into the fabric of her suit, his grip tightening as her own hands found their way to his hair. It had been so long since she had allowed herself this. Touch, warmth, the feeling of being wanted. He lifted her easily, pulling her onto his lap, her knees bracketing his hips. His breath was hot against her skin, trailing from her lips to her jaw, then lower, the scrape of stubble sending shivers down her spine. She wasn't used to this kind of intensity, this kind of devotion. The Zenari didn't believe in love, in passion, but Daniel did, and she wanted to learn. Her hands slid under his shirt, fingers mapping the planes of his body. She felt his heartbeat, steady and strong, beneath her palm. He groaned softly at her touch, his head tilting back, giving her access to the curve of his throat. She pressed a kiss there, reveling in the way his fingers dug into her hips in response. Then suddenly the moment shattered. A proximity alarm blared through the ship. Kiris pulled away, breathless, her pulse hammering. Daniel was already moving, his hand reaching for his weapon as he pushed her behind him. She checked the screen. The Zenari. They had found them. Daniel's jaw clenched. "Looks like we don't have time to take things slow." She smirked, heart still pounding for an entirely different reason now. "We never did." The hangar was filled with ships, rebel fighters preparing for the battle ahead. Kiris and Daniel moved through the crowd, both of them moving like they had always belonged here. The rebels believed in them, in their plan, in their fight. Kiris had never been someone worth following before, but now standing at the center of an army that had once been scattered, she felt something close to purpose. Daniel's fingers brushed against hers as they reached the war table. His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "You ready for this?" She exhaled. "I have to be." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. His voice was softer when he spoke again. You don't have to be. We can still turn back." She shook her head. "I'm not running anymore." Something flickered in his gaze. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was brief but full of promise. "Then let's burn it all down." The battle was chaos. Ships darted through the darkness, weapons firing, explosions tearing through the sky. Kiris moved like a ghost, cutting down Zenari soldiers, her mind focused only on one thing, reaching Varuk Taven. She found him in the command center, standing tall, his blade gleaming under the emergency lights. "You should have come back," he said, his voice even and motionless. Kiris tightened her grip on her weapon. "I finally made my own choice." Varuk tilted his head. "And now you'll die for it." She attacked first. Their blades clashed, sparks flying between them. She was faster now, fueled by something stronger than duty. She had something to fight for. Varuk was skilled, but he fought with precision, with calculation. She fought with fire. She dodged, ducked, then struck. Her blade sank deep into his chest. His eyes widened in shock. Kiris stepped closer, her voice a whisper against his ear. "You never understood, did you? Love makes us stronger." She twisted the blade, and Varuk fell. She didn't look back. The battle was over. The Dominion was broken, their control shattered. Kiris stood at the edge of the warship, watching the last of the Zenari forces retreat. Daniel appeared beside her, bruised, bleeding, but alive. "It's over," he murmured. She turned to him. "For now." His lips curled into that familiar half-smile. "You really don't know how to celebrate, do you?" She rolled her eyes, but before she could say anything, his hand was on her waist, pulling her close. She barely had time to react before his lips were on hers, deep, desperate, full of everything they had survived. She melted into him, her hands threading through his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. She could feel the heat of his body, the way he needed her just as much as she needed him. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. "I love you," he murmured. She felt her heart stop. The words were foreign, terrifying. But when she looked into his eyes, she knew. She kissed him again, slower this time, her hands cradling his face. "I love you too." And for the first time in her life, she knew what it felt like to be free. The night was quiet, the weight of battle still lingering in the air. The smell of scorched metal and distant fires clung to everything. But the war was over. Kira stood at the edge of the docking bay, staring out into the vastness of space. She had spent her entire life fighting, surviving, following orders that were never her own. And now for the first time, she had no orders to follow. She felt his presence before he spoke. Daniel stepped beside her, his fingers brushing against hers, warm and steady. She didn't pull away. "It's done," he murmured. "The Dominion's lost its grip. The rebels are already moving in." She nodded but said nothing. He glanced at her, studying the way her eyes lingered on the stars. "We could stay, help rebuild. People will need leadership." Kyrus turned to him, searching his face. "Is that what you want?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I spent so long fighting for something, and now that it's here, I don't know what comes next." She looked away, exhaling. "I don't either." He reached for her then, gently taking her hand in his. His thumb traced small circles over her skin, grounding her. "We don't have to know." Her chest tightened. "I was never meant to have a future, Daniel." His grip on her hand tightened. "Then let's make one." Her breath caught at the quiet certainty in his voice. She had spent her life being told what she was meant for. She had never been given a choice, until now. She turned to fully face him. "What does that future look like to you?" His lips curled into that small, familiar smile, the one that had undone her from the very beginning. "Whatever we want it to be." A flicker of fear stirred inside her. She was trained for war, for discipline. She had never been trained for this, for peace, for love. But when she looked into his eyes, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just him and her. His hand came up, brushing against her cheek. "We could go anywhere," he murmured. "Find a quiet world. Get lost in the stars." Her heart pounded. "And what would we do?" Daniel leaned in, slightly, his lips barely an inch from hers. "We could stop running, stop fighting." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt without realizing it. "And if I don't know how?" His breath was warm against her skin. "Then I'll show you." His lips met hers, slow and deliberate, as if sealing the promise between them. She melted into him, her body pressing against his, her hands tangling in his hair. His arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer, his grip firm but careful, as if afraid she'd disappear if he let go. She deepened the kiss, her fingers tracing the curve of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. The battle was over, but the fire between them burned just as hot, igniting something deeper, something more. His hand slid down her back, slow and deliberate, his touch sending shivers down her spine. She felt alive in a way she never had before, every nerve in her body attuned to him, to the way he moved, the way he felt against her. He pulled back just slightly, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing hard. "Tell me you'll come with me," he whispered, "that this," his hands tightened around her waist, "is real." She closed her eyes, her pulse racing. "It is." "Then let's go," he murmured, his lips grazing her jaw, down to the curve of her neck. "Let's disappear." She tilted her head, allowing him more access, her fingers gripping his shoulders as a soft gasp escaped her lips. The intensity of it, the need, made her dizzy. "You'd give up everything for this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. His lips found hers again, a slow, deep kiss that stole every thought from her mind. I already have. Her chest ached with something unfamiliar, something terrifying. Love. It had crept up on her when she wasn't looking, taken root in her, grown into something undeniable. She cupped his face, searching his eyes. Then take me with you. His breath hitched, then slowly a smile spread across his lips. Anywhere. He kissed her again, harder this time, his hands gripping her hips as he backed her against the wall. The urgency between them was different now, not desperate, but certain. The battle was over. The war had been won. But this was just beginning. His fingers found the zipper of her suit, sliding it down with deliberate slowness. Her skin tingled as the cool air met her exposed flesh, but she barely noticed. All she felt was him, his warmth, his touch, the way his lips followed the path his hands made. She let herself get lost in it, in him, in the feeling of being his. He pressed her tighter against the wall, his lips trailing down her collarbone, his hands mapping every inch of her, like he was memorizing her. She gasped when his fingers traced the bare skin of her back, his touch gentle, reverent. "You're mine," he murmured against her skin. She tangled her fingers in his hair, tugging him back up to meet her lips. "And you're mine." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but at the same time they felt right. She was his, and he was hers. She had spent her entire life following orders, being nothing more than a weapon. But in his arms, she was something else. She was free, and together they disappeared into the stars.